Hello and welcome. I am Liz Gerber. I am a professor and associate dean for research and policy engagement at the University of Michigan. And welcome to the fourth session in the Poverty Narrative series, a virtual conference dedicated to a deeper understanding of poverty in the US and especially the Midwest. Our goal over the course of the series is to promote in-depth, impactful, and solutions-oriented coverage of poverty-related issues. So far, we've explored lessons on inequality from COVID, how to rethink the poverty narrative, using data in storytelling, and much more. If you missed our previous sessions, they are all available on our website, poverty.umich.edu. This series is supported by the Midwest Mobility from Poverty Network with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As a professor of public policy, I think a lot about how to explain complex public policy problems to my students in a way that both informs their understanding and that motivates them to take action. In today's session, we'll explore many of those same ideas around the theme of where public policy meets real life. In our discussion today, I'm honored to be joined by veteran journalists who will share their experiences cutting through the wonky world of policy to uncover the real-world impact of policymakers' decisions and the role that academics can play in helping the public understand these issues. Before we dive in, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions in the comment box on the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #PovertyNarrative. We look forward to having a meaningful conversation, and we're going to try to get as many questions as we can. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue, and we want folks to know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. In addition to hearing from our great panelist lineup, one of our goals with this series is to build a network of academics, researchers, practitioners, and journalists. So I invite you to join this community, check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty researchers and journalists at our website, again, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining me today. First, we have Melissa Sanchez, who's a reporter at ProPublica, Illinois, who's focused on immigrants and low-wage workers. Her work examining Chicago's punitive ticketing and debt collection system helped prompt major city reforms, including the end of driver's license suspensions for unpaid parking tickets and debt relief. You'll hear from Melissa in just a few moments. Second, we have Jonathan Cohen, who's a senior national correspondent at HuffPost, where he writes about politics and policy with a focus on social welfare. He's also the author of Sick, the Untold Story of America's Healthcare Crisis and the People Who Pay the Price. And third, we have Christine McDonald, who is an investigative reporter at the Detroit News with a concentration on data and computer-assisted reporting. Her work has saved Detroit homeowners thousands of dollars by forcing the city to retool its broken tax assessment system and prompted crackdowns on landlords abusing the tax foreclosure auctions for profit. Thank you all for being here today. Each of you have reported on stories that have had an important impact on public policy and have helped the public to understand some complex systems. We'd like to have each of you tell us a bit more about your reporting project that you've worked on and the impact it had, starting with Melissa, then we'll go to Jonathan, and then we'll go to Christine. Melissa.
All right, I'm gonna see if we can share my screen here. Share. All right, can everybody see my screen? I hope.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm a reporter at ProPublica. I started in the fall of 2017, just after having my first child, and I was sleep deprived and trying to figure out what the hell did they hire me to do? What am I supposed to report on? And I was trying to figure out what my first story would be when one of my colleagues in the New York office published a series looking at how the U.S. bankruptcy system was really failing Black America, the type of consumer bankruptcies that the Black people, particularly in the South, were choosing, very often wound up leaving them without any debt relief. And the type of bankruptcies that white people were choosing did give them debt relief. And so he did this big project. And in journalism, we have a word for like the little stories that go with the big stories. He did a sidebar on what was happening in Chicago. His project focused largely in the South and Memphis, but he did one story looking at a boom in bankruptcies here in Chicago. And as part of this relatively small for ProPublica story, he cited a paper out of Columbia University that looked at racial disparities in the types of bankruptcies being chosen in the Northern District of Illinois' bankruptcy court, which is where Chicago is. And that paper, which was written by economists and bankruptcy professors, cited the fact that there was a large share of the bankruptcies filed here contained debt to local government agencies, particularly the city of Chicago. And that some of that debt was tied to parking tickets. So this is what had been out there. And so I started at ProPublica and we decided, why don't I look at what's happening with the city of Chicago, what's happening with this ticket issue? Because nobody had ever written about it in the city, except for this academic paper that probably nobody had read until we started writing about it. So early on, the way that my project worked, I sort of divided the reporting into three different categories. One was what to me is the most important, like talking to humans, talking to people who are affected, and from them trying to figure out what the story is, what I should be asking the authorities. And they, like those interviews with regular people, are what really guided all of the work that I did. The second was understanding the bankruptcy system and trying to figure out how to get data out of a system where there is no data. And the third was understanding the city's ticketing system, which also involved a lot of data and records requests. So I want to tell you about LaQuanda. LaQuanda Renault is one of several dozen people who I interviewed who had wound up filing for bankruptcy over unpaid tickets. She's a young woman. She got pregnant in high school. She left her home when she was really young. She worked. She was trying to attend college at night and had a very long commute each day that involved multiple bus rides and train rides to get her kid to daycare, to get herself to work, to get to school after work, to get back to her kid, and then to get back home. And this long commute was really harming her and her child. And just taking them, her boy wasn't getting into bed until after 11 o'clock at night because of this long day. And one of her neighbors started taking pity on her because he could see her riding the bus so late at night. And he said, hey, look, why don't I sell you my car for just a couple $100? You can then, just cut down on your commute time and you'll be safer. So she bought the car, not knowing, as a lot of us don't know when we moved to Chicago, that being a car owner in the city, it comes with a lot of requirements. And the most important one to the work that I wound up doing was that you have to buy a little sticker for your windshield. You have to pay the city between $85 and $130 every year for this sticker. And if you don't have it, then the police can give you a ticket for $200. If you don't pay that in time, that debt can escalate to $488. If you're somebody like LaQuanda who makes minimum wage and get a couple of these in a few weeks, then you wind up falling into this downward spiral. The city can then go after your driver's license, they can take your car away, and it really hurts your ability to live your life. So that was a big part of my reporting, was talking to people like LaQuanda. The second was understanding bankruptcy court. So it's a federal system. There is not a website that you can go to where you can download all of the data and see how many bankruptcies in Chicago were tied to tickets. You have to build that kind of data set. There's a system called PACER, which is like the electronic court records for federal bankruptcy court. What we essentially had to do was build scrapers that went into Pacer and extracted particular fields of information that would give us what we wanted to say to be able to quantify and explain this trend over time. But to do that, each page that you look into costs 10 cents. And if we the volume of cases here is in the tens of thousands. So to do that would have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars, which ProPublica were a pretty well-funded nonprofit, but we would not have paid that. So we wrote a letter to the court asking for an exemption to use Pacer for free. And I wanted just to share with you, because a lot of people don't know that you can do this with federal courts. So I wrote a very clear letter explaining that we're a nonprofit, that all of our work is free and available to the public, and very explicitly explained what I hope to do with the data, with the court records if I was able to go into them. And within a week, the judges gave me the okay. And that what that means to me now is that the judges were really overwhelmed with the number of bankruptcies being filed in their courtrooms, and they too wanted to know what was going on. So I don't have the technical capacity to build scrapers, but my colleague at the time, David Eaves, is a news apps developer. So he built scrapers, which I like to think of as little robots that went in and pulled the necessary fields from all of these different pages inside of the system. And this is just a small example of different ways that the city of Chicago could be spelled in the list of creditors that the folks had. So we had to go in manually and check a lot of these out, strip the ones that we didn't think were relevant, like the City of Chicago Water or City of Chicago Heights, which is a different municipality. That work took months, but ultimately we were able to use it to say very definitively that not only had the volume of cases exploded over the previous decade, but the amount of money owed to the city of Chicago, probably for parking tickets, had also more than doubled from about 1,500 as a median per case at close to 4,000 a decade later. So bankruptcy was just part of the story. That we also I filed dozens of records requests with the city of Chicago, with the state, to understand like the ticketing and debt collection apparatus leading folks into bankruptcy. So we're talking like tens of thousands of bankruptcies filed just to deal with the city. And the bankruptcy gave you this legal relief that allowed you to get your license back, to get your car back. That was the reason why people were filing, and it was cheaper to file for bankruptcy. $0 down in Chicago than getting on a city payment plan where the down payment was $1,000, which was unattainable for a lot of people. So this is a picture of my friend Elliot's desk. Elliot's a reporter at WBEZ who I wound up partnering with several months into this. And he's a little better organized than I am, but just so you can get a sense of all of our records requests tied to this. So I wound up getting millions of records on tickets. I think maybe 40 million or so tickets issued in the city over the previous decade. And we had to weigh a lot of different issues when deciding how to analyze them. We didn't have the addresses or race of where the person who got the ticket lived, but we could extrapolate some of that because we were able to get the zip code of where the vehicle owners were registered. And the zip code is a pretty decent proxy for other smaller geographies because Chicago is so segregated. So we were able to cleanly say that that was disproportionately piling up in Black Chicago. I did some of the work originally, the data work using censusreporter.org, like pulling census information for zip codes. I was really limited at first and only used Excel to do the analysis. Over the course of reporting this project, I wound up learning to use SQL because it was the volume of data was so large. I couldn't do it with Excel without crashing. But for the first pass at all of the work, I was just looking at 1 year of data at a time, and then matching the zip code demographic information with what I pulled from Census Reporter. And then later, my colleague at the time, a data reporter named Sonia Kambampati, pulled the data from the actual data from ACS, from the U.S. Census. So I talked about this. The base problem here was that debt was escalating a lot for people. The base amount of the tickets was just too expensive, $200. But then the doubling of a late penalty plus the collections fees was what was leading people into a hole. And revenue from tickets is really important to the city. 7, 8, 9% of the operating budget, depending on the year you're looking at. And so I talked about license suspensions a little bit. Lots of people are losing their licenses in Chicago, mostly for unpaid parking tickets and unpaid camera tickets. We have speed and red light cameras here. And there's a lot of problems when you lose your driver's license. You can then wind up in the criminal justice system if you get pulled over for driving with a suspended license. And then, state data showed us that the vast majority of people who were losing their licenses and who were wound up getting arrested for a driver's license for driving with a suspended license were Black. We try to show in different ways that the racial disparities of what was happening with all of these issues. But license suspensions, you can see Chicago, where Chicago is in the map, where the license suspensions are happening in the city, and how it's the Black neighborhood. It's like the same map of Chicago over and over. In the bankruptcy records, I was able to identify the person that had the most ticket debt, a woman who had $100,000 in debt. And I was sure that there was like a mistake in the receipts, that could not have been true. But it was true, because she got dozens of these city sticker tickets. She lived in a gated public housing project where police would just go in, walk around, and issue ticket after ticket after ticket after ticket to the same car on the same day. So if you get hit with 3 of these in a single day, how do you pay $1,500 if you're making minimum wage at a fried chicken shack in the city, and also trying to raise 3 kids? So here's a little piece of what the data for this particular woman looked like. You can see that in the course of 90 minutes, she got 3 of these $200 tickets. And that's just one day. You can understand how it quickly built up to more than $100,000. But her story then led us to ask the question of, like, can the city do this? Can you ticket somebody so many times in a single day with this really expensive violation? And it turned out you couldn't, but the city had been doing it over and over and over. So we wound up doing a lot of stories to address different parts of this very unfair system. The more we looked into it, the more convoluted, just wrong it seemed to us. One of the problems that I dealt with a lot was getting pushback from people, as kind of moral argument that, why don't you just pay your tickets? And so one way that we kind of reframed it was thinking about whether the city was actually making money in this process, and whether specific policy decisions that they made to raise the costs of particular tickets, including that city sticker ticket, led to the revenue that they projected. And the story that we did, showing how it actually didn't, I think was one of the game changers for us, and what really compelled policymakers to actually change their behavior and change the policies. So before that, it was just like, oh, sorry guys, sorry that we're hurting you, but it's your fault for not paying the tickets. Doing the reporting that then looked specifically at the policy and revenue implications, I think helped change the public narrative. We also built an app that we purposefully made it at the ward level. Chicago's divided into 50 wards, but we showed different racial disparities, including who appeals tickets. It turns out Latinos don't appeal tickets very much, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why, like what wards have the most debt, et cetera. And kind of all along the way, I'm talking to researchers about the work, reading lots of books, and trying to figure out who knows anything about this. Nobody had ever looked at anything like this before. We made all of our all of the ticket data, those tens of millions of rows, free and available to the public. They've been downloaded, I think, like 1,500 times at this point, largely by academics and some community activists. So we did that on purpose, because there's a lot of stories I wanted to do on this that I just didn't have the capacity or the bandwidth to do. But I'm really excited to say that there's lots of researchers who are looking at this now. I just talked to a couple of people yesterday from Princeton and MIT who are doing their own project on ticketing in Chicago. And I've been talking to dozens of researchers since this started, both on their own projects and then me getting advice on how to do the work. And the stories have had a ton of impact. State law change, ending the license suspensions over parking tickets. Their payment plans have been reformed. There's been some amnesty, not enough, in my opinion. They've made some changes to the city sticker program, reduced late penalties. And the U.S. Supreme Court is going to look at an issue later this year on whether a practice I didn't even get into related to towing is okay. And stuff keeps happening. I just talked to an alderman yesterday about more potential reforms that could be coming. So it's a story that never goes away for me. And that's all that I have. Happy to take questions later on. Let me get out of here.
Melissa, thank you so much. Jonathan, you're next.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody out in the virtual audience for being part of this. Thanks, University of Michigan. This is exciting for me because I'm a policy journalist, and there's a lot of people out there who, usually when I talk about policy, people's eyes start to glaze over. So it's exciting to be part of a conference that's all about policy journalism. And although I realize part of the question here is, well, how do we make policy journalism interesting, and how do we kind of get people to pay attention to it, and how do we write our stories? As Liz said, I work at Huffington Post, HuffPost as it's now officially called. Before that, I was at the New Republic. And my trajectory has been a little weird in that when I started in journalism, I had aspirations of being a newspaper reporter. The writers who I looked up to were these great daily writers who would follow the news and then write these, eventually sort of write longer stories and books that were still very focused on real people and real stories. Some of my favorite writers are people like Catherine Boo, who, if you read The New Yorker and know that she wrote a book a few years ago called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which was about life in Mumbai. Or going back further, there's a writer named Alex Kotlowitz who wrote a book that was very influential to me called There Are No Children Here, which was about growing up in some of the housing projects in Chicago. And that was sort of the journalism I had wanted to do. For random reasons, I actually ended up working first at a policy journal, not even a real magazine, more of a journal. They didn't really have reporting and writing in a sort of what I had hoped to do, and instead was much more of an exercise in seeing policy at the 30,000 foot level. Turned out I actually liked that. I didn't realize it at the time. And turns out I'm the kind of person who, gets excited about a new congressional budget office report. My main beat is social welfare, but my main beat within that is healthcare. I write a lot about healthcare. That's probably about 3/4 of what I do. So, when the issue of health affairs, it used to show up in my mailbox. Now it shows up in my inbox. I get excited. Ooh, what are the new papers? What's the new research findings? And when I get to talk to academic researchers at conferences, I look forward to that. I think, wow, this is a great opportunity to learn. So that kind of stuff really interests me. As my editors like to remind me, not everybody feels the same way, and it's hard to kind of get people to sort of engage with that. Partly for that reason, and partly because I am still that old newspaper reporter. I do like to sort of write about policy in terms of real people's stories and go out and sort of not just sort of tell you what's in the report or what the projection is, or if I'm writing about healthcare, what this policy will mean for the number of uninsured. I want to introduce you to somebody who it's going to affect. I want you to know what it's like for that person. There's a bit of a complication, at least in my case, which is that traditionally, when you write these kinds of stories, if there's a sort of organic way they can begin if you're on a daily beat. So if your daily beat, if you work for the Miami Herald, where I grew up and where I was a summer intern, and you were covering healthcare for the Miami Herald, then you probably built up a bunch of individual stories, and every once in a while you'd stumble across a story and say, wow, this is a really fascinating tale. This is a really engaging character, and it kind of tells a broader story. It's that little story that tells the big story, and you have it right there. And so you start there, and typically you work from that story up to the big picture, and then you start maybe you read up on it. You talk to academic researchers. You sort of say, well, wait, is this something that's going on in other places, and what does it mean? And if this is a policy piece, well, what could be done and what is being done for these people, or what is being done that is going badly for these people? I always have to work backwards. I'm sort of starting with the big picture and then trying to find the little picture, which is a little tricky. It's a little bit like trying to cast a movie, because you start with this sort of overarching sense of, I want to write about X issue. I want to write about something big, and now I need to find somebody or some buddies to illustrate that. I remember when I was working on my first book back around 2002 and 2003, and it's a book about the failures of the U.S. healthcare system, and I was in Southern California, and I'd known just from the phone calling I'd done already that if you wanted to, I wanted to focus on people in low-wage jobs who didn't have insurance. And I knew that security guards in buildings were very frequently uninsured. And so I actually made flyers, like 300 flyers, and walked around neighborhood office buildings and just started handing them out, saying, and they were bilingual. And I said, if you've got a story and whatever. And I will tell you that was not the most high yield exercise of my reporting life. I did get a few phone calls. And in the end, it was through one of those reporting exercises, I was able to find someone who actually became the central focus of a chapter in my book, who in fact was an office security guard and was not able to get healthcare. Now, there are easier ways to do that. And I've technology has helped. Social media is a fantastic way to meet people. Facebook in particular can be very useful if you can get yourself into the right circles. This past year, just in the last few months, I was part of a team at HuffPost where we were doing a sort of a project on the effects of the COVID pandemic on Detroit. And we a couple of us got together and we basically said, we are going to find people who are on the front lines, healthcare workers, and we're going to follow them for 2 weeks and then write about it. So how do we find these people? Well, I put a note on Facebook. I just said, hey, I'm here in Southeast Michigan. I'm a reporter. If you're a friend of mine or you're seeing this post, please pass this along. Please post this. I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like to hear about what your life is like for the next 2 weeks. And that actually got a number of responses, and several of the people who came in through that ended up in the article that we ended up publishing. I've done the same thing. I did a story not too long ago about childcare deserts, which, if you know what those are, which are places where just there aren't enough childcare providers or not enough childcare providers who sort of meet, have good credentials, meet the sort of safety and quality standards that you would want. And again, I posted something on Facebook, and that was an extremely useful use of Facebook, because it turns out that Facebook, there's quite a lot of working parents who have groups on Facebook. And in fact, I learned later there were 2 or 3 where apparently my message went sort of very viral, and I got a ton, within a span of an hour, I got 30 messages from parents saying, hey, I'd love to talk to you about this, which, among other things, was indicative that, okay, this is a problem that needs addressing. Obviously, a lot of people are really struggling to find childcare. The best part about this kind of reporting, though, is that when you do this kind of reporting, when you go from the big to the small, if you do your job right and you meet enough people, inevitably what you see and hear will complicate your narrative. You will start to question your opening premise that you went in with. You'll have to re-examine it. And, one of, among the things that can happen is you might come out of it and say, you know what, this isn't a story, or the story is the opposite of what I thought, or at the very least that this is a lot more complicated than you thought. And I think that always makes a story richer when it has that nuance. When the sort of lesson, when writing about policy in particular, there's this temptation to draw a very simple lesson, and having, one of the things I've sort of learned, I think the hard way over all these years, is that policy is never simple, and that when you translate ideas into real life, things get complicated. And the best articles, I think the best journalists, are the ones who don't run away from that. They don't run away from the nuances. They don't run away from the complexities. They embrace them and they try to explain them. And I think it makes for a stronger piece. To sort of talk about how that all came together, can come together, I was thinking about a particular story that was actually from about 2 years ago that brought these different strands together. It was 2017. So I guess actually, sorry, that was 3 years ago. I got to work on my math. 2017, and if you remember what was going on in the spring and summer of 2017, Donald Trump had just been elected. Republicans had control of Congress, and there was a big push to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which was right on my beat, right in what I normally would be writing about. And we were looking for stories, ways to kind of, obviously we were going to be, part of my job is I share this beat with another writer who writes on healthcare, and then we have congressional correspondents. We have a whole Washington staff. So part of my job was just to write about who was proposing what and what it would mean. But we were trying to think of proactive ways of really sort of spotlighting the impact that some of these new proposals that we were hearing from the Republicans about what it would mean for individual people. And one thing I wanted to write about was Medicaid. If you remember the debate early on, there was a lot of attention being paid to pre-existing conditions. That this was something that the Affordable Care Act had tried to address. Now there were going to be these new repeal and replace bills. Were they going to provide similar protections? How are they going to be different? But as someone who had followed the Affordable Care Act, I know that I knew that Medicaid was an equally big part of the story. If you just look at the numbers on healthcare, the number of people who get insurance through Medicaid is actually larger than the number of people who got it through these sort of private insurance exchanges, and so just in terms of share scale, that was actually looking like an even bigger part of the story. And I knew that going in, and I talked to some academics, and but I went back to my sources, and I went back to researchers, and I went back to advocates, and one thing they kept bringing up was people think of the impact of repealing the Affordable Care Act on Medicaid in terms of people who got insurance and will lose it. But there's a whole other part to the story, which is that there's a lot of people on Medicaid who were on Medicaid beforehand, people who qualified for various reasons. And these proposals will affect them too, because the proposals called for changing the financing structure of the Medicaid program as a whole. And one group in particular that kept coming up in my conversations, and I hadn't really thought about it, were people who had physical disabilities and depended on Medicaid for services. And one place this came up was I got in touch. I tried to. We were trying to be sort of geographically diverse about this, but I'd done a story already in sort of different parts of the country. I'd done one in California. We'd done one in Florida, and based in Michigan, I started calling advocates here in Michigan and across the border in Ohio. And it was talking in Ohio that I ended up on the phone with a group there that works with people who have disabilities. And they mentioned that they had a former summer intern who was still very involved and had actually gotten involved on his own as a political activist. And one thing that was interesting about him was he had cerebral palsy and was a full-time student at Kenyon College. His name was Justin Martin. And Justin was able to live on campus. He went to classes. He was part of a student improv group. Because of the services and supports he was able to get through Ohio's Medicaid program. So I got to talk to him, and I got to interview him and made contact. And just interviewing him, just hearing about his stories, it was remarkable to me as somebody who had covered healthcare for basically 20 years. I was not aware of the extent to which Medicaid funding from the state underwrites all of these supports and all of these services. Nor was I aware of the extent to which that funding sometimes fell short, even in the current system. And so in talking to him and gaining that understanding, I was able to sort of see, sort of get a sort of real life story of what Medicaid meant to this one person. And then he kind of lowered the boom and he said, look, he showed me around his apartment. He showed me, he showed me some of his schoolwork. We talked about, his life on campus, and, the nights he spent up debating, English literature, or sometimes, what the best Harry Potter movie was. And he said, but basically he said, if Medicaid funding gets cut, I am, the category of services that he was using, a lot of them were these sort of so-called optional services, were likely to be the sort of first things that would get cut if Ohio lost some of its federal funding, and he basically would have to leave college. So I wrote about that, and I wrote about him. And it was, at that time, really not a lot of people had been paying attention to that part of the debate. But the article went out, and, I don't know what impact it had or not, but I do know it got a lot of circulation around the time that issue started to get more attention. But the the best part for me was that knowledge, that learning from him, not only helped me to write that particular story, but gave me a sort of base of knowledge that I've been able to use ever since, in terms of writing about Medicaid, about long-term care issues. And in fact, that actually came very much, was very useful just recently when I was writing about the coronavirus epidemic, because of what I learned from Justin, because of what he taught me and the knowledge that I got from him, I knew a lot more about that whole financing system for long-term care. And as you know, is that system that created, the sort of situation. It's the same system that pays for nursing home care and group home care. And of course, in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic, that has been a major problem. So I was able to write intelligently. I mean, I hope I was able, who knows? But I mean, at least I could come into that story with some background knowledge because of what Justin taught me, which was because I was able to find him, which was because I was able to go from the big to the little. And, it's a reminder to me. I always, remind myself that as a reporter, we always look for these stories to illustrate our arguments or illustrate our analyses, because they do grab readers. I mean, let's face it, most people would rather read a story about this really interesting kid in college than, about some, CBO report on what block grants for Medicaid would mean for optional services. But we don't just do these to educate our readers. I think in the end, we do them to educate ourselves. We learn something. I'm a different person. I know so much more from that story and others like it. I think it just equips me to do a better job and equips us as reporters to do a better job going forward. So I'm going to stop there, but forward to talking more in the rest of the session.
Jonathan, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I wanted to just share with everyone before we move on to Christine, a nice comment that we got from a member of the audience, Fran, who says, I'm a Kenyon alum and we're so proud of Justin. His graduation comments were amazing and speaks to the community that is Kenyon. So thank you for that, Fran.
Thank you.
And then just one quick note before we move on to Christine. Christine, we're coming, I promise. I just wanted to remind viewers that you can submit questions for Melissa, Jonathan, Christine, or any of the speakers via YouTube or Twitter. So we're going to look forward to a nice, robust discussion after Christine.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this. It's interesting to me because without that help, so this was of interest to me. And I'm at the Detroit News. I'm a daily reporter. I've been here for about 15, 16 years now. And more recently, I guess in the last 10, real problem in Detroit of people losing their homes over property taxes is what we're talking about. And that really kicked up after the housing crisis in 2008. And so thousands lost their home to mortgage, that foreclosure in Detroit. That was a real problem. But the bigger problem has been tax foreclosure. And it was more of a slow moving crisis that happened over a number of years after the crash. And it ends up, our numbers show that more than a third of properties in the city of Detroit have gone through tax foreclosure, which is pretty stunning to think about. And so, we've been covering it in different ways all those years. We felt it was one of the most important issues facing folks in our city and have dedicated a lot of resources to it. And the most recent piece we did is kind of what I want to talk about, I guess. It was an investigation that was done by myself and a colleague or a freelancer actually named Mark Betancourt out of Washington, D.C. And we looked at kind of quantified how much people were overtaxed by the city of Detroit when the city, which it acknowledges, did not properly value homes when it set its values for property taxes. Those assessments are based on the city's analysis, which uses home sales data to come up with this value for homes. But, after that crash, the market tanked so severely, and Detroit never adjusted or didn't, for the vast majority of properties after that, didn't adjust for that kind of tanking of the market. And so we had people who were really paying these inflated tax bills. And we first wrote about that. The Detroit News exposed that back in 2013, and wrote extensively about how that was affecting folks and people were losing their homes, and how dramatic it was is that the city was only using a very small percentage of sales that it deemed proper to include in those sales, like a 6% figure, I think was the number of sales over that time period that they were including, and in setting these values. So a very small number of the sales were being used to base these numbers, and they were those values were wrong, and people were being taxed on it. And so the state came in 2013 and 14 and said, hey, the city that you have to do a reevaluate all these properties. And they did that. And it was a long process. And so the more recent story we did that ran in January was using those numbers that the city went in and corrected for people's properties and estimate back in time how overtaxed were folks. And so we were able to come up with what we feel, and that experts confirm that were conservative estimates, that folks were overtaxed by at least $600 million in Detroit in property taxes between 2010 and 16. So those are big numbers, and just hard to think about. But we wanted to look, we felt it was important to put a number on that, because it was always kind of a given that folks realized that this problem had happened. These homes were overassessed, but at this point, no one had tried to attempt to put a number on it. And but we not only put a number on it, we felt like it was important to bring it to today, because so many people still are facing the loss of their homes through this tax foreclosure process. And just a quick background on that is, you in Michigan, you would lose your property if you don't pay your taxes for 3 years. So that's where folks were getting behind and then losing their properties, and they were auctioned off to buyers who would come in and evict them. So we used that data, that analysis we did in that 600 million big number that we came up with, and looked at, of the people today, as of last year, they're facing foreclosure, which are 63,000 properties are in debt as of last year. How many were overtaxed in that time period? And we came up with a number of almost 90%. So the vast majority were overtaxed during that period. And what was stunning to us, in particular, the stat was that of those homes, 40,000, what they owed was less than what they were overtaxed by. So they were facing eventual foreclosure for debt, an amount that they were overtaxed, essentially. And so we did a lot of pieces on this. It took quite a long time to do this analysis, more than a year. At the Detroit News, I've been here for a while, and unfortunately, like many other papers, we've lost staff and don't have the resources that we've had in the past. So it was very difficult to do this work without those resources. And luckily, I was able to partner with Mark Betancourt, who pitched this, and came up with this idea. And then we partnered with Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, who helped us get data. They actually helped us. We hit a roadblock with some of the data we needed from the Wayne County Treasurer's Office, and he wanted to charge us over $200,000 for a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, on people who were still in debt. And so we needed that data, and Reveal helped. Like in Melissa's case, she talked about a scraper to basically scrape that treasure site and be able to get that data, so we could go ahead and do that story, because $200,000, $235,000 wasn't doable for us as a newspaper. Let alone, this is public data that was already online, but just not available to us in bulk. So that was the problem. So So we used this data. I think part of the key part of it was putting an online tool where people could put in their address and see what our estimate for their overtax amount was. So that was one of the most popular parts of the project, obviously, because people want to know directly how it affects them. And I still, that ran in January. A lot has happened since January in the world, obviously, but I still get emails, about this project and from folks, residents who are looking up their overtax estimate that we've calculated for them and are frustrated. I mean, we featured a woman, just as an example for you, Anna Bolden, who she bought her house in 2011, right a couple of years after the crash, for only less than $5,000. And at that point, the city was taxing her as if the house was worth $57,000. So, this issue has had a lot of staying power. A lot of researchers have looked at, even today, arguing. There's a professor at University of Chicago, Bernadette Atehene, and she and Christopher Berry is another researcher. They think that low-valued properties are still being overassessed. So, we continue to look at this, but I think it was important for us to spend the resources, particularly to go back in time and see how badly folks were overtaxed and tell them and give them that information, and then to take it to today, and for there's so many people still facing foreclosure, and how that debt made it that much more difficult for them to get out and of this problem. And so, we're still pursuing stories on this, but it has been difficult because, the story ran in January, and obviously COVID happened in March. But, after the story, we had a ton of reaction and had several folks in town held forums. One forum I went to had more than 500 people show up to talk about this. So the impact was really wide, and we'll see how things develop. I mean, there's been work even before we did this latest article on how to compensate people for that loss, and folks are talking about giving city-owned properties, to those folks who are affected, or giving them first crack at different programs that the city offers, whether it's job training or help starting a new business. But at this point, the city officials are saying they don't have the money to repay folks for this amount. But many, folks are not satisfied with that. But we continue to cover this issue. But it's one that just had started and just was kind of came about by just continued coverage of one issue, this tax foreclosure. We've covered many issues related to whether it's who profits from tax foreclosure, who's buying the properties, to, how people are being evicted and what policies are not being followed. So luckily, I've been able to stay on this beat for this long and have help by a variety of sources, whether it's freelancers or people, academics at U of M, who've, helped me get data and look at it and clean it and some of the basics. But, or because otherwise these stories would not, I wonder if they would have been written, frankly, without that help. So that's kind of the gist of what I have.
Oops, I'm mute. Sorry. Fantastic. Thank you. Wow. What interesting coverage. What interesting stories you guys have all been working on. We're lucky to learn from you. I learned so much even in these 45 minutes about all three of these topics. So I really, really appreciate that. Okay, we're going to turn to questions. Two questions came in, Christine, that you sort of anticipated in your comments. So I'm going to skip past those and go straight to a comment from, I believe, one of my former students named Jungmin, who writes, I'm interested in administrative and psychological burdens that cause frustration, which prevents individuals from exploring all options due to low program awareness and complicated administrative processes. So, hi, Jungmin. Thanks for your question. I would love if any of you wish to take that question to think about how you think about the complexity of some of the work that the policies that you're reporting on, and what you as journalists might do to reduce some of those burdens for your readers. And any specific examples would be terrific.
I can jump in. One thing that came to mind when I saw that, even with this ticketing issue, is the city at one point created like a debt relief program for some city sticker ticket debt, which is in so there's about $500 million worth of that kind of outstanding debt. And I was super optimistic when it first happened, and just really grateful that like this would happen and help people. But the city had a cumbersome process that you needed to go through in order to qualify for that debt. You had to go online, you had to find out about the program, you had to like fill out some paperwork, and as a result of that administrative or bureaucratic burden, very few people signed up. I think only like 11 or $12 million was wiped out of a potential 500 plus million. So it was really disappointing. And I think kind of as a reporter, I should have been more thoughtful about early on, like, why are you guys, and been critical to the city government about why are you creating these unnecessary barriers? Why can't you just automate it? So a lot of what I've been thinking about recently, and as I talk to aldermen or elected officials about things they can do to fix the problem, to me, one solution is just to automate the process and don't make poor people go through a lot of paperwork when you can just do it on your own and save them that hassle.
Mm-hmm.
I can add too, that's a huge similar issue with this tax foreclosure. And the fact with just is even more galling is that in tax foreclosure, these folks, many folks, poor folks, low-income folks, didn't even have to pay these tax bills. They could have applied for an exemption. You know, if you make under a certain amount, even before these reforms were put in, you don't have to pay these bills. So the vast majority of people didn't know about it. And those who did, it was just a crazy process where you actually had to initially go down and get an application for an application. So you would go down and get one application and then fill that out, and then they'd send you another application. So they've streamlined that now after lawsuit, so things have improved, I think, from what I've heard. But you know, that was one issue of why we spent so much time to put this data that we came up with and we got from the city that was so difficult to get in terms of the values of homes over time. So we had this trove of data between 2010 and 16, 17 on what the home values were of all these properties, and trying to figure that out. That we wanted to make sure we had, once we cleaned it up and we understood it, we wanted to make sure we shared it. And we did, and it was a little cumbersome just because, you know, we, unfortunately, the realities of the newspapers, we don't have a lot of staff to make some of these apps or lookups really streamlined, but we got a functional one up, and that's been really popular where folks have been looking up that data.
Awesome.
Yeah, if I can just jump in real quickly, I mean,
please.
I would say this is a well-known problem with our healthcare system, which is that we often have a lot of this patchwork of programs that we have for people to get health insurance. It's very hard to figure out. You know, people are either not aware of what they are eligible for, or they don't, or they find it difficult to sign up. And again, this is something where I think, you know, as someone who was reading the big stuff on, you know, reading policy reports, didn't get until I sort of really started years ago, sort of, you know, interviewing people. And it was amazing the number of times you would find someone and you'd be listening to their story and you'd realize, you know, you might be eligible for, in your state, there's a particular X program that was created for people who fall into this category, or actually you probably qualify for Medicaid, or your kid can get onto the children's health insurance program. But awareness, you know, people weren't aware. It's hard to apply for these programs. And it's sort of a well-known that one way to sort of shrink these programs, if you want to, without looking like you're shrinking these programs, is to add to the paperwork burden. In the last year and a half, there was a lot of efforts in a lot of states to add work requirements to Medicaid, and or some people call them work requirements because they felt more like paperwork requirements. And there's a debate about it, and obviously you can debate, that they're useful, they're not useful, they whatever. But it's a reality of these programs, and certainly in when I've spoken to people, there's this fatigue that sets in, and it's like, you can go and you can apply, and what ends up happening is the most motivated people can make their way through the obstacle course, which is good, that is there for them. But so many people miss out. And obviously that raises questions both about, well, what can you be doing to make it easier on people on an individual level? What can you be doing within the context of this sort of patchwork system? And or is that an argument for taking a totally different approach? So anyway, that comes up a lot in healthcare, and it's kind of an ongoing reality.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. Question from the audience from Patricia. She asks, I teach statistics and I'm curious about how much training in statistics journalists like you have had, and how much statistical training is typical in journalism programs. And I think underlying that is the question, should it be more?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
Please. I really wish I had taken statistics in college. Like, if I could go in a time machine right now, that's like number one on my list, because I've sort of tried to teach myself and I've done a horrible job. And I inevitably end up on these really embarrassing phone calls with people who know statistics and just having them walk me through things. Because it's at the point where I don't trust myself. Like, I actually don't trust myself to navigate this world well enough. Christine and Melissa may be much better at this than I am. I'm not. And I really wish I were.
Yeah, I think in college I took one data class, like a computer-assisted reporting class, but everything else I've learned just on the job, with my colleagues, like teaching me how to use SQL, essentially. I think I took one class through an organization called NICAR, that's part of Investigative Reporters and Editors, the national organization. So they do trainings throughout the year for journalists. And I think it's probably more common now with younger journalists than with us, right? Like, I think everybody knows now that data and building apps and doing all this stat stuff is more important than maybe our professors taught us in college.
I think sometimes it's a good thing that we have to start from the bottom and understand this stuff, right? Because we've got to explain it to everybody, a wide range of folks. So, we go through that pain of starting from scratch and trying to understand this. And then we've got to explain it to folks in a way that they're going to understand as well. So, sometimes it's a good thing, but it is traumatic for us often to go through this.
Christine, it sounds like you, from your comments, that you have partnered quite a bit with academics, with university partners that might have those skills as well. Melissa and Jonathan, have you found that to be a useful strategy, or is there a barrier that prevents you from collaborating with academics that we might want to be aware of so that we can share some of that expertise? Because needless to say, we take a lot of statistics. And then the challenge of communicating them is often really great. So do y'all see potential for more partnership in those areas?
For me, I think there's the possibility of doing those in a formal way, but we haven't needed to. I have a lot of informal dialogue with a lot of academics who kind of help me, and I help them with their projects. So I have, like with the bankruptcy project in particular, there was the first professor who looked at this researcher at Columbia. Him and we developed a relationship of trust, and I would share with him what I was actively working on, and he would do the same, and I would share him raw data, and he would do the same with me. And we would kind of talk each other through what we were hearing about. It was never in like a formal way, like, ProPublica is in partnership with Columbia, but it was more like a one-on-one kind of relationship.
Interesting.
I think ProPublica would probably allow an academic partnership, but it's a little bit more complicated to bring in the bureaucracies of two organizations. But we cite the work of others. Like, I cited his work and I've talked about him constantly at our different organizations. But I think we do have the resources in-house to do the data. this statistical work.
Yeah, I've never done a formal partnership like that. I wouldn't say it was out of the question. Certainly, I like Melissa, I would be sort of, there would be some navigating to do and thinking through, as a writer for an independent media institution, there's always a sort of what institutions are you okay joining with and partnering with, and I also, like Melissa, I think like a lot of reporters, I definitely have a kind of loose network of academics that I know pretty well, and policy experts who I frequently will go to if I have time. You don't always have time when you're writing, but if I have time, I will go to, if I have a big story in particular, or like a feature story, I will go to them, and after I've written my story, and you can't really show someone your story, but I'll send a paragraph that's like a description of how a policy works, or I'll sort of read aloud, kind of like I'm saying this and I'm saying that, kind of my own fact checking, basically, and saying, did I get that right? Did I describe the way the money goes? And almost, I mean, it's sort of like trying to invent a sort of kind of a 10-cent version of peer review, I guess. And I should say, I know there's a lot of academics on this call. If you're an academic who a researcher who is kind enough to do that for a reporter like me, thank you. And in general, thank you for being an academic and taking phone calls from someone like me who calls up and asks you to explain and distill, your life's work into 30 minutes, knowing that at best you may or may not have like a line that appears in the article. If it wasn't for those conversations, I wouldn't understand all the things I do. And I'm very grateful for it. So thank you.
Nice. Thank you for that. Wonderful. Okay. Let's get some more questions. From Anne Marie, we have a question about healthcare. Anne Marie writes, healthcare's story is one of rationing by hassle. Sounds like a similar story for the property tax relief system. I think that probably goes to Christine.
I guess I'll have to, I'm not sure exactly what she means by rationing by hassle. Sorry. Maybe one of you can explain.
I read that a little bit as similar to what Jonathan was saying about all the major hurdles that a consumer has to, a person has to overcome in order to access the service.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. Then she's right on, because I think the main argument and that what the city relied on is that people could have appealed these values. So there's a small window every year, and is if you're a homeowner in Michigan or probably other states, you have a similar system where there's a couple week period where every year, it's usually February, March, where you can go and appeal your values. And so that's what the city relied on, acknowledged that more recently acknowledged that the system had collapsed, but that, people had the chance to appeal and they didn't. And so that was a really lengthy process. When we reported on it originally, basically folks said you had to hire someone to do it for you to get anything done. And what we found were the vast majority of major landlords and major property owners, business folks that had large property were hiring attorneys, and they were getting results. They were on it, on those appeals really aggressively. But regular Joes had no idea that they had this process. So it definitely, to get relief, you had to really know the ins and outs of the system. And obviously folks argue that it should not be that way. And especially that people should not be losing their homes because they didn't, in part realize they could have appealed this value that was so out of whack to begin with, that anyone could have, by just looking at it, know that it was wrong.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Where are we? Let me go to a question from Diane Jenkins. Diane Jenkins Ali, who writes, thank you. Simple solutions are best. How do we keep this data relevant and updated so that we can monitor policies not relapsing, or I guess prevent policies from relapsing? Also, to generate a how can I help myself mentality in the community is needed. So I'm thinking, Melissa, the data that you're talking about with regard to the violations is certainly an example where that data continues to be developed. So how can we ensure that it's relevant and updated and useful to people so that they can take action in their own communities?
That's a really good question and something I've been thinking a lot about recently. The data that we posted publicly and like all my analyses, I think the most recent data I used was from the end of 2018, and the 2 decades or so before that. But almost 2 years have passed since then, and it's so much work to get the data, to clean the data, to make it useful for the public. And I'm not going to do that as my full-time job. So I was just talking to an alderman yesterday about policy solutions, and he asked me that very question: how do we know whether the reforms that have been put in place so far have worked? And I said that's really good. Like, who do you guys have on staff who can work with R, who can work with SQL? And so I think it's something that like we as an institution are thinking about, and how do we devote our own resources. Part of the reason that the fact that so many academics are now interested in this is helpful, because they will carry out the research on their own. There's been a lot of papers that have been published kind of as a result of this. But I think, I don't know, I mean, at some point, like your news organization is going to like have to stop covering one issue on a full-time basis. And hopefully it can wind up in the hands of community or researchers who will follow through. But it's something we struggle with, because you don't have enough resources to stay on top of one thing forever.
Interesting suggestion, though, that, often academic partners might have those different resources and the ability to continue data collection and making data available to the public, even after news organizations might have to move on to the next story, the next topic. Christine or Jonathan, would either of you like to comment on that? Or
sorry. Yeah, there was a story that an exact example of that, where a couple of years ago I did a piece on evictions in Detroit, and we struggled to get any data. Courts in Michigan aren't covered under FOIA, and so a lot of the data is public at an individual level, and but the bulk data is the problem, as Melissa illustrated in Illinois as well. And so we had a breakthrough with the court in Detroit where they agreed to give us the data, and so we did several big pieces on evictions and how the city. How many evictions were happening in the city, and how the city wasn't enforcing rental standards for homes, and looking at even just who was evicting the most folks. And then just more recently, I just looked at Detroit, right? Because unfortunately in our business, you have to pick your battles and look at those, what a community that you think you can pull that data off. Even that took more than a year for us to do. And but more recently, Professor Margie Dewar and a large group of folks that she works with did a larger analysis of evictions in Michigan, and looking at all the suburban communities and the inner ring suburbs. And you're seeing a lot of high eviction rates in some of these communities that we didn't know about. So to me, that's a really good example of that. Sending in the larger troops to get at those stories, that they had more resources than we did, and it was really enlightening. And I hope to do even more stories based on their research from there. So that's just one example, I guess.
Cool, nice. Okay, Christine, coming back to you. You addressed this a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate. Daniel from the audience asks, have you done an update to show loss of homes due to COVID specifically, and the folks' ability to pay their mortgages? And would evictions due to the virus tie into this? We know there's been complications, maybe both positive and negative, with the eviction moratorium on the one hand, yet increased economic hardship on the other hand. So Daniel, I'm expanding a little bit on your question. I hope that's okay. It seems like, COVID is a really interesting case there, interesting and potentially a terrible way if it means that even more people are losing their homes due to eviction.
Yeah, I think it's early right now just because we have some protections in place for mortgage and eviction. But you're right. I have been contacting the local courts and to find out how they're going to proceed, because in Michigan, our eviction ban ends at the end of this month. And what's interesting is that there was some recent guidance from the state court on how these evictions should proceed. And a lot of people think that they are good changes, but they are going to be administratively kind of a nightmare for these courts to figure out how they do this at the same time that many of them are not open and they're doing Zoom calls, which is just, it's going to be fascinating and to follow. It's very important to follow this on how this proceeds. But one small example is that typically when you go to eviction court in Michigan, it's a kind of a cattle call situation. There isn't a specific time for someone's case to be heard. But now the state court administrator's office is saying, hey, each of these has to have a designated time. They have to be informed that there could be represented by a nonprofit lawyer, and they have to be informed about their options for aid that maybe through the state or other means to pay their rent. So it's really gonna be important for us as journalists to watch these courts, not only in Detroit, but some of these inner ring suburbs. And I'm just a little intimidated on how we're going to be able to do that with the staffing that we have. We at our newspaper we're had to have required furloughs. So many of us have been off for a while, and it's very hard to be covering these major issues when you've got smaller staff. So we're brainstorming ways that we can cover this, but he's dead on right that we need to be on this, because I think it's going to be one of the hugest issues in the wake of COVID, particularly in Michigan.
Agree.
Yeah. One thing this is an interesting question, and this is sort of not so much on my beat, but it speaks to what Christine was just talking about, and I think it's so important to cover these stories. There's one of the interesting things going on, and you may have seen there was a story over the weekend, I want to say, in the New York Times about this. The way the sort of federal assistance on COVID worked out was that the sort of unemployment checks for lower income workers were quite high. Actually, they were actually higher than for a lot of them, actually a lot of people making more money than they were at their jobs. And that plus some of the other assistance in the aggregate data, if you look at it right now, it looks like poverty not only didn't go up by as much as it was expected to, may have actually fallen, which be sort of remarkable. And I'm curious, and this is something to sort of investigate. Number one, that's what the aggregate data can tell you, but is that actually happening for individuals, or is this a situation where for some people it's working out well and for some people are really in much worse trouble? I suspect there's some of both. But at the same time, also, what lessons are we learning about that? Because there is this debate, right, about in anti-poverty policy about there's this idea of, should we just be writing more checks to people rather than all this sort of targeted assistance? And that data suggests that. So, looking at eviction data in Detroit, for example, is like one really good way to test out what's actually happening that you're not going to really see in the sort of big data, at least for a while. So that's great, and a plea for like more resources for newsrooms everywhere, because everyone's getting squeezed, and I worry a lot about that too, because where would we be without those stories that we were just talking about, that Melissa did, and just anyway, yeah. A little editorial there for support your local newspaper.
I support more resources for newsrooms too. So I think you're preaching to the choir in this group, but it's very important to remember how important those resources are. So Jonathan, your comments about sort of aggregate versus individual level impacts of some of these public policies ties in nicely to one of the questions we got from a member of the audience, from Diane. And this is for specifically for Melissa. Do we know how many of these tickets in the aggregate get written off as like bad debt or never get paid, or, so it sounds like a lot of your reporting is about what happens at the individual level, but also then, can we talk about what's happening in the aggregate? And in particular, from my perspective, I'm super interested to know, now that some of these reforms have been put in place, has it made a difference in the aggregate?
Yeah, so I don't know the numbers offhand. One of the problems in Chicago is that in Illinois is that there's no statute of limitation on debt collection if it's the government that's collecting debt. So the city can go after people for debt since 1990, which is where the 1990 becomes like their default, because that's how far their data goes back. I mean, it was probably on paper before then. And that's why we can have, $2 or $3 billion worth of debt. In the data, you can see that there's some, like in some cases, there's like an indication that maybe the debt was like written off because the person died. But no, I mean, so one analysis that I did do was look at payment rates over the course of a year for different kinds of tickets at different prices. As you can imagine, the more expensive the ticket was, the less likely it was to be paid within that year. So that city sticker ticket, if I remember correctly, the payment rate was about 1 out of 3 tickets were paid within a year, whereas cheaper tickets that might have been like $60 for parking at for an expired meter ticket were paid like at significantly higher rates, like 60 or 70% were paid within a year. That all said, one of the biggest problems I saw, and I continue to scream about elected officials, is the statute of limitations issue in Los Angeles. And in New York, which were cities that I used to compare Chicago with, there were clear statutes of limitations of like 5 or 7 years that you could go after folks for debt. And the amount of outstanding debt in those cities was significantly smaller, a few million or a few tens of millions, not a couple of billion.
Thank you. Question, I think for all of us. Question from the audience is, Black Lives Matter demonstrations and police brutality incidents have dominated the news cycle and our collective conversations lately. How can journalists and academics contribute to discussions about the types of policies that can reduce police brutality and racial inequality more generally? A nice small little question.
So I would say that if you're an academic and you'd like to contribute to the discussion, let's say you're just using my example in Detroit, I want to hear from you. There are reporters at our papers that want to hear from you. I hope that we don't seem inaccessible, but I'd love to, so if there's a topic you think that we should be taking a look at, like why did Detroit use tear gas? Why did officers institute a curfew and then back off the curfew? If there's, a discussion there and a point there that you think that we should be taking a deeper look at, contact a reporter. It could result in a story. It could result in a column, on an op-ed. I think particularly us, as I've touched on before, we're short-staffed. We have fewer reporters, but we're always looking to do these stories and maybe missing them in the heat of just getting the daily paper out. So if the question is, how do we get these broader conversations going? Contact a reporter that you respect their work, maybe, and then we can pursue it from there. I hope that it's somewhat helpful.
That's very helpful.
Yeah, I rarely hear directly from academics on the things that I care about or that I'm interested in. It's usually the other way around. Like I have to go into JSTOR and see who's written what, and you don't always have the time to do that. So I think Christine's got a really great point. Like if you are working on something and you think it's relevant to the news, like if you've studied how, police reform accountability efforts in New York City worked out, and you don't see anybody talking about it right now in this moment, like send an email. There's like most organizations will have a general tips email box, and they're often full of crazy people with crazy ideas. But if you came in with like a really thoughtful idea, like, and you said, hey, and I wrote this paper, and like, don't write us like a book about it, but like try to write a couple of clear sentences about what the point is and how it's related to what's happening now, and you will get people's attention.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, police brutality is not on my beat, but racial disparities in health is very much on my beat. And I too, actually, I've been involved in another project the last few weeks, and we kind of have my head in that for a little bit longer. But I have actually been thinking what I want to write when I get back onto my sort of daily beat, and been thinking a lot about what I can be writing about this. And I would love to hear from people who can suggest stories about that. And in particular, there's a kind of well-known, I think, people who are familiar know that, okay, there's people who have insurance, there's people who don't have insurance. The actual experience of getting healthcare, how is that different? What is it? And there's a whole gambit of issues. I've certainly read about those. I know there's a literature out there on them, but I'm especially interested in hearing from researchers who work on the ground, and they can be in the public health field, they can be in the medical field, they can be in the social work field, but what they're actually seeing. And so I feel like one of the lessons that's coming out is that the racial disparities just cut so deeply beyond statistics in terms of the lived experience of African Americans in this country. And to be able to write about that would be, ideas for that are always very welcome. And I hope I'll get to do more, and I hope we all get to do more. So if you're an academic who has some, you're a researcher, you have some ideas, especially if they're the kind that lend themselves to something that, can be written about as, sort of with a personal angle about, real people. I think those are really good stories. And I think belatedly, but importantly, there's an audience for them.
Yeah, I think so too. I'll take my prerogative and jump in on this too, as the representative of the entire academy on the panel. So there certainly are organizations within universities that are committed to helping create a means for this back and forth, for engagement between the academic research that's taking place, journalism that's taking place, and organizations working on the ground in various public policy areas. And so I'll just give a pitch for Poverty Solutions, the one of the sponsors of this event, along with the Gates Foundation. We're very committed to this. Academics and journalists are often talking about the same issues, but in different ways, and with using slightly different language and slightly different framing. But Jonathan, your point that often there are studies out there that academics are doing, which, when paired with personal stories that journalists might be pursuing, could really, create this very powerful combination. And it goes both ways. I would also say that, certainly in my own work, journalists often contact me if, after I've published a couple of papers in an area, there's some ideas out there that folks are picking up on. I'm always, very excited to be able to talk to journalists about that. So I do think that universities are increasingly committed to supporting faculty and students working within the universities in engaging with journalists and engaging with the broader public. Many of us in the university setting are doing research on police brutality, on protest, and sort of the history of protest. You already see some of that in journalism due to this kind of back and forth, but I certainly think there's a lot more room for it. So efforts like this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. I'm getting a 6-minute warning, which it's hard to imagine that somehow we've already spent almost an hour and a half together. I think there's so much more we could talk about. Let me offer just one or two more comments. Here's one on, I think for all of us, that I think it would be an interesting way to sort of bring some of this to a close, which is, all of you talked about policies which put pressure on public officials, on government officials. Can each of you comment on how you deal with the reactions of those public officials when your reporting brings up controversial policies that might be challenging for public officials, whether it's elected officials in government or in other parts of the public space? When your reporting challenges them, how do you deal with that?
One thing that I like about my editors and where I work right now is that we do what you call no surprises journalism. So I call everybody that's any policymaker, any elected official that's related to what I'm writing about. I tell them what we're going to write before we write it. I let them know exactly what it's going to say. So hopefully any major explosive blow up will happen before publication and we can deal with it. And if there's, if they have challenges to the reporting or the framing, then we can address them early. But otherwise, and then the next day when stories are published, then I go back to them and I say, did you read this? What did you think? And those conversations can be difficult, but I think I've learned a lot from doing that. People respect you more and appreciate you more for showing your face the next day, and are going to be more willing to continue engaging with you. So I haven't had any major problems because people know what's coming before anything is published.
Practice.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jonathan. No, go ahead.
Okay. So no, I was gonna say I try to. That's exactly what I try to do. Also, is let people know what's coming out beforehand. I mean, you don't read them the story, but you tell them what's coming down the pike, and those are not always fun conversations, but you do it, and it's good it's good practice because sometimes you got something wrong, and again, I always feel like a story is better. A story is always better when you get the other side and you can bring that out. So yeah, I think that's the best thing you can do. And look, sometimes you're going to write something that's going to make people angry, and that's kind of your job, and you just do it. But as there's a kind of built-in discipline, which is if you write stories that are way off, people will stop talking to you because they will not trust you. The flip side is, if your stories are accurate, even if you make people mad, they'll or uncomfortable or whatever it is, reaction you get, they'll still, people will still talk to you because they trust you and they feel like, hopefully, at least not always, but hopefully they feel like you're acting in good faith.
I would just say the same. You can't have any surprises, in particular when you're working with data, because if the data is theirs, you need to understand every portion of it. And it's especially with Detroit, it was it was so easy to misinterpret data. So I had to constantly have that strong relationship where I'm asking their questions and they're answering. And to be fair, the city did. Other divisions in our government for that story did not, but the city supplied me with that data and responded. So I think it's just important to think of that as a reporter, and that, I've had some instances where officials will even announce reforms before our piece is run a couple times. It's the fact is you want to get it right, and you don't want to rush, and you want to understand the data. And that's some of the process that you have to go through to do that and get it right.
Fantastic. Well, we're at time. To be respectful of all of our time, thank you so much, Melissa, Jonathan, Christine, for your thoughts and for participating today. I personally learned so much. I wrote down in one of Melissa's early slides this idea of moving the conversation beyond poor victims and whether city policies make sense. Sorry, I was trying to read my own handwriting. You know, I see, to me, I see a lot of that in what all of you guys are talking about, which is, you know, covering poverty is hard and important. And, you know, talking about the people, but then also challenging the policies is a huge part of what you all do. So I am grateful to all of you. I know our audiences, I know your readers are as well. I also want to thank all of you who have tuned in and participated on YouTube Live. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry, I know that there are some that we weren't able to get to in the interest of time. And we will share those with the panelists. We invite you to continue to tune in to the last session in this series, which is going to be held on Thursday, June 25th at noon. The title of that session is Using Personal Stories for Systemic Change. And we've got Marisol Bello from Community Change and Marissa Kwiatkowski from USA Today. I imagine many of these same topics will come up in various ways during that. And so don't miss that session. For more information, you can go to poverty.umich.edu. With that, I will thank you and wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.